Greenhouse Gas Disclosure and Emission Benchmarking. The presenter is Sorabh Tomar.
I'm really excited to share my research with you. It's about, and sort of complementing the last paper, it's about mandatory greenhouse gas disclosure and how it can change the actions of the emitting firms. So we've seen, a growing chorus of concern from climate scientists about the consequences of global warming, and to keep the world below that 1.5 degree target, there's going to be some drastic actions that have to be taken by large emitting countries. We've seen a number of national net zero pledges being made, but despite all that, most greenhouse gas emissions still attract no explicit penalty, neither legal nor economic. The favored policy response of economists is carbon pricing, but with the exception probably of the EU's ETS, widespread carbon pricing has has had a hard time getting off the ground due to political resistance. So I think it's worth asking, is there any other policy response we can implement to at least get the ball moving in the right direction? And that's where I think disclosure presents itself as an attractive option. And for one thing, it meets with less resistance typically because it's not as hands-on as other forms of regulation. So we've seen firms increasingly shift towards voluntarily providing ESG information. And on the mandatory front, we've seen regulations in the EU and the UK. We've also seen the US SEC pushing for a mandatory carbon risk disclosure rule by the end of 2022. And while a lot of these mandatory rules that are in existence or being proposed, a lot of them are geared towards investors and informing investors. We also have a lot of other literature in economics suggesting that disclosure can be used to curb socially undesirable behavior. And we've seen this in a context such as restaurant hygiene and employee safety in mines. So, tying all these threads together, I think the question falls out, can mandatory disclosure be a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And if so, what's the informational mechanism through which this occurs? So I'm going to address these questions by studying the US Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, and I'm going to call that the US program for brevity. So what does this thing look like? Well, in 2010, US facilities, these are factories emitting more than 25,000 tons of CO2 equivalent, they have to report their greenhouse gas emissions to the EPA, and then that information is eventually made publicly observable. These disclosures are self-certified, but that said, they're enforceable under the Clean Air Act, and facilities are subject to a fine of up to $37,500 per day of a reporting violation. Interestingly, and this is in contrast to, for instance, the UK's mandatory greenhouse gas reporting rule, which is at the firm level, the US program provides really granular operational level information. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at some of the data. So if I go to the EPA's website and I zoom in on the US map, I can get to Dallas and I can get to West Rock, which is a pulp board manufacturing facility. And I can see an overview of its emissions. I can see trends over time. And if I click on that View Reported button on the bottom left-hand corner, I actually get to see sub-facility information at the machine level. So I can see that West Rock used Coder infrared dryers. It used a Coder oven. I can see the heat or energy capacity of these machines. I can see what fuels they used. I can see what specific greenhouse gases were emitted from each machine. So this is super granular information. And this is going to be important for my hypothesis development. The other interesting feature about the US program is the implementation timeline. So in 2010, facilities started measuring emissions. In 2011, they reported them to the EPA. And then in 2012, the 2010 data was made publicly available. So it's nice from a research perspective because we have three information regimes. We have no measurement, nothing happening in 2008 and 9. Then we have measurement and private reporting to the EPA in 2010 and 11. And then in 2012, that disclosure switch flicks on. So that's what the program looks like. Going back to the earlier discussion, we know that disclosure can curb social bads in a number of contexts. So the natural hypothesis is that facilities are going to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions following US program disclosure. The literature typically argues for something called an action cycle. So for instance, if restaurants have to put up hygiene grade cards, customers are going to stay away from the dirty restaurants. And the restaurants will anticipate this, and they'll preemptively take actions to improve their hygiene. So, does something like that happen in the US program setting? I have doubts about that. And this comes down to a couple of factors. Firstly, the US program data are not that salient. So they're, on a government agency website, they don't get a lot of broadcasting or advertising. But from my own experience working with the data, they're really difficult to aggregate to the firm level. And they're incomplete. They don't include emissions generated abroad. But if we think of the stakeholders, investors that are selling stocks of a firm or customers that are boycotting a product, these are all actions directed at the firm and not to a particular factory or facility. However, I talked about the granularity of the data, and I think there could be an operational level informativeness. And it's pretty easy to conceive that a peer facility or a rival might be interested in its rival's disclosures. And this could raise red flags that spur innovation or highlight ways to improve. So if I'm a cement manufacturer and my rival operates in the same town, and now that I learn my rival from their data, they're producing cement and producing 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions that I am. I'm going to be interested in that for couple of potential reasons. Firstly, I might learn that my rival is burning less fuel to produce the same amount of cement. So that might highlight that there's an opportunity for me to become more efficient, and this will help my bottom line. Or it might be that I don't want to be seen as the worst of the pack. And at some future stage, if other stakeholders start using this information, I'm going to be the one that looks really bad and getting all the scrutiny. I might take actions to sort of improve my performance. In either scenario, the facilities are learning about their own relative standing using their peers' data. So this is what I call benchmarking. So my approach is going to be to run a difference in differences regression. So I have disclosure as my focal event, and then I have a symmetric window 2 years on either side of that. And I'm going to see how did the emissions change following disclosure. To preview the results, I'm showing you the raw logged CO2 emissions of US facilities in the blue line there at the bottom. And I'm benchmarking that against another set of facilities in red that's not subject to this regulation. And I'll talk about that benchmark in a second. But the thing to notice is that the trends track each other quite closely. And once measurement and private reporting to the EPA happen, they still track each other. There's no real change in emissions. However, once disclosure occurs, that's when I see the US facilities emissions falling relative to the benchmark. So what's the benchmark? It's Canadian facilities. And I have data for Canadian facilities because they have always been reporting to Canada's greenhouse gas reporting program throughout my sample period. But they're a good control group also because, as this figure shows, the parallel trends assumption holds. So they seem to be comparable, at least prior to disclosure. In addition, Canada and the US are both modern economies with access to advanced technologies. Their economies are closely integrated, so year-on-year GDP percent changes track each other quite well. And importantly, their energy networks are also very integrated through a vast pipeline infrastructure that shuttles oil and gas. So in my formal analysis, I had control variables and I employ a two-way fixed effect structure. So eventually I use a facility as its own control, and I account for all industry-specific supply and demand shocks. And in my preferred specification, I get to a 7.9% emissions reduction due to US program disclosure. And that's consistent with H1, and that's a non-trivial amount. So how does disclosure lead to an emissions reduction? And this is where I switch to H2 and I focus on the benchmarking hypothesis. And I I come up with 4 predictions that I would expect to see under benchmarking. The first is that if facilities are setting standards using each other's data, I should generally see the dispersion in emissions across facilities decrease as they become more similar. I expect the relatively more GHG intense facilities to reduce their emissions more. I expect facilities that are owned by benchmarker firms to reduce their emissions more, and I'll talk about what I mean by a benchmarker soon. And then finally, I expect facilities to become, more technologically similar as well, if there is some optimal sort of technological structure that they're converging to. So how do these predictions play out? Do I see them in the data? And the short answer is I do. I see emissions dispersion decreasing, and here I'm comparing US industries against the respective Canadian industries. I see that if you tend to produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of good produced, you tend to reduce your emissions more. And this test is actually pretty nuanced because I'm measuring greenhouse gas intensity using 2010 data, and it's predicting emissions reductions in 2012. And that makes sense because the 2010 data only became observable to firms in 2012. However, when I construct the intensity measure using 2011 data, I don't find that it has incremental predictiveness for 2012 emissions. This makes sense because the 2011 data wasn't observable in 2012, which again is consistent with this benchmarking story. What do I mean by being a benchmarker firm? Well, here I borrow data from Bernard et al. And in their Journal of Financial Economics paper, they pretty much have web search data. And they can see when firms are searching on the internet for other firms' financial filings. So they can see, for instance, when does Apple download Microsoft's annual report? So I take that data, I identify these benchmarker firms, and I find that the facilities owned by them reduce their emissions incrementally more than the non-benchmarker facilities following US program disclosure. And finally, to examine technological convergence, I consult another data set, which is the National Emissions Inventory. And that pretty much tells me what are the technologies being used at the facility level. So as an example of a technology, I can see whether a facility uses a commercial external combustion boiler that uses pulverized subbituminous coal with a wet bottom. So that's a pretty granular categorization. So with this list of facilities and the technologies they employ, I show that going from pre-disclosure to post-disclosure, there is a technological convergence. And in particular, or in addition, facilities become more like the carbon light peers, and they become less like the carbon intense peers. So the convergence is in the expected direction. So what have I shown you so far? That disclosure leads to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and the patterns are consistent with the benchmarking story. What I do now is I take a step back and I consider, well, what about the role of just measuring and reporting emissions to the EPA before disclosure? What gets measured gets managed. Is that true in this setting? So I extend my sample period back by 2 years, but here I run into an issue, which is there is no data in 2008 and 9. So what I do is I went through some of the atmospheric science literature, and I learned that when you burn a fuel under the same conditions, it produces the greenhouse gas CO2, but it also produces carbon monoxide in a similar proportion, or in some fixed proportion. And I have facility process CO carbon monoxide data since 2008, and that's because it's a toxic pollutant, and firms have always had to disclose that. I also have EPA lab data that gives me priors for what these proportions should be. And my data in 2014 in the post period also gives me some input into what these relations are. So I combine the priors and the data, and I run a Bayesian estimation. I produce these beta processes above my head, and I apply these relations to all of the CO data that I have, and I produce my own CO2 estimates. And in short, when I extend the difference in differences, I do not find a significant emissions reduction following measurement and private reporting. It's really disclosure that leads to the emissions reduction. Finally, I consider the role of external pressure. Are facilities responding to some outsider when they reduce emissions? And I go here to the main purpose of the legislation, which was to inform future legislation. That was one stated aim of the program. In short, I find that, and how do I measure the political environment by looking at which states are facilities located in, and how do those senators feel about climate change legislation. And in short, I find that the facilities with climate change progressive senators tend to reduce their emissions more. and progressiveness predicts emissions reduction. So I do find some evidence that, legislative concerns drive emissions reductions. So I think that was my 15-minute mark. In summary, I find emissions reductions following US program disclosure, benchmarking seems to be a key. If we ever move towards carbon pricing, we're going to have to collect this type of data. And my study is suggesting that there is some benefit from making this publicly observable. So looking forward to Matt's discussion and the Q&A. So thank you very much.
As Sorabh said, the discussant is Matt Gustafson. And Matt, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great. This is a really cool paper that I'm excited for the opportunity to be able to discuss. The big picture question, which I think is clear from the presentation, is just whether emissions disclosure affects emissions itself. And then kind of if so, why and by how much would be these follow-up questions. Main result is that when the US passed a fairly broad-based emissions disclosure rule and the data that they were collecting became publicly available, emissions began to drop in US firms relative to Canadian firms, which are the control sample used in the paper. The paper then provides a variety of tests that supports, or given my discussion also, is consistent with a benchmarking mechanism here playing a role in what's going on. And I think the idea there is that when a firm sees the emissions and or technologies that their rivals are using, they, the ones that are high emitters tend to transition to lower emissions. Either maybe there's some evidence that that's because of technology adoption, or perhaps maybe to ensure that their image isn't tarnished or something of that nature. So, I mean, my initial reaction is that, this is a really important topic. There should be many papers on this topic, and this paper is extremely thorough, but with the appendix, it's probably over 100 pages. And I'm not surprised. It's currently R&R at the top, arguably the top accounting journal. And this is a cutting edge topic that's of really high policy importance. So it's got a lot going for it. What I'm going to do is just provide a brief comment or two on the motivation. And then I'm going to focus mostly on the main results. And so, given that the paper is 100 pages long, some of what I say perhaps could be partially addressed in like a reordering of things to some degree, but I'm going to kind of focus on where the paper starts and what the main narrative is of what's going on here. So, anything I say shouldn't be interpreted as like an overall indictment of what's going on, but just some suggestions on maybe how to make it clearer or to improve things. So I wasn't, I felt a little bit weird about the motivation, because the way that I think about the disclosure is that it almost has to be less interventionalist than some more aggressive policy like, carbon pricing, right? So I think just a transition of the language there a little bit to talking about disclosure as kind of a first step, which isn't not done in the paper, but I think toning back the motivation a little bit, in particular, what comes to mind is there wasn't much discussion of like the SOX literature, for example. I mean, there is some evidence out there that disclosure is quite costly in a sense. And so I felt a little bit, jarred by the fact that the lead-in was about how less oppressive a disclosure thing would be compared to other actions. So that's just a small comment. The bigger takeaway is that this is a really cool setting. The paper uses the unique data well, but I could see a career being made off of the type of data in this these disclosures. All right, so let's go turn to the main result. If I kind of just cut through all the interpretations that are given in the paper, it's really saying that emissions in the US relative to Canadian facilities dropped by 5 to 10% in 2012 and 13 compared to 2010 and 11. There's decent fixed effects in there. And so I do believe that result. But the first challenge for the paper is to plausibly suggest that this is causally due to this disclosure rule change. And I actually think the paper is fairly close there. I think I have a few suggestions here, but I think in general, I do believe that there is a causal effect of this disclosure rule change. I would like to see more discussion of the time series, and in particular, as I'll kind of get to by the end of this, if I talk fast enough, in particular, the timing of adjustment, I think, is really important for this benchmarking story compared to other stories, right? So this stuff becomes available in 2012, and immediately there's a big disclosure drop. So I want to know more about, like, how can you adjust these technologies so quick, and how does this happen? Because, you know, an alternative is that in 2010, when they saw all this coming, they started adopting technologies, and finally they were like ready to roll in 2012. And so I think more discussion of the timing would be really helpful here. I also think that, and I don't know the exact, there's a lot of ways to do this, but I think the idea that the Canadian firms are affected should be embraced more. So I am on board that the US firms should be more affected. But when you get down to, like, for instance, the border analysis in the appendix, like, it's not exactly clear, you know, how Canadian firms are going to be hit by this too. They should be somewhat affected. So the ideal figure here, I think, would be the blue line starting out on top of the red line, both lines dropping in 2012 to the same point. Now, it's never like a perfect experiment here, but I think what this figure shows is that, you know, the Canadian group might be the best control group, but it is not a perfect control group. And so I'd like to see some more tests along those lines. I hate pointing this out, but I really think in this case, the standard errors should be clustered by something to do with industry or firm, because right now, the same firm's observations in 2 consecutive years are considered independent in the current structure. Okay, so the second set of tests, just a few small comments. So the paper's showing that, like, the range or the standard deviation within an industry is decreasing, and arguing that that's consistent with benchmarking. I would just make sure to scale those measures by the mean, because we know the mean is dropping, and so the range is inevitably going to come down if the mean is. So I would scale those measures in columns 1 and 2. With respect to columns 3 through 6, I think these tests have a lot of potential. But I would like to see more descriptive statistics on kind of the different firms that are falling in either place on this scale. You could even do like a pre-trends going back quite some time, potentially, maybe at the firm level, and just showing that the groups that are ending up as high and low emitters are really similar on a variety of dimensions. So I'd like to see a little bit more there. Now, the interpretation of this second result as benchmarking, I think, is where I have perhaps the most trouble. You know, with any corporate finance or accounting paper, the mechanism is the hardest thing to show. We have a nice policy experiment for the main question, and I think that in some sense that's enough for publishing a nice paper here. But the type of alternatives that I have in mind are well, I'll just kind of move forward to a more full description of it. But I'd just like to see, you know, a more aggressive laying out and refuting of alternative stories. I think one that's fairly consistent with what is shown in the paper, for the most part, is, let's say that the US is adopting more clean energy technologies around 2012 than Canada. And let's say that the new technology takes a couple of years to implement. It requires investment and it lowers emissions. Then if we kind of, you know, think about, well, maybe that there's some firms that have already adopted prior to 2012, or maybe the high emitters even adopt this new technology first, then you could get something pretty close to, you know, the set of results presented in the paper, right? It could easily be that the reason these high emitters are adopting this new technology is because of the disclosure. That I am much more comfortable with, but taking that next step to say, that they're not adopting it until they see everybody else disclosing in 2012 is like getting into an arm wrestling match over how long it takes to adopt technologies and how quickly you can respond to disclosure. And so I would just like a little bit more open-mindedness on the mechanism. And just to conclude, I think it's a really important paper. I think there's a few empirical tweaks, as I suggested, that can lead us to a pretty compelling story that emissions disclosure impacts emissions, which to me is the important question. It might not be the interesting question, but to me it's the important one from a policy perspective. Now, establishing benchmarking as the driver of that is tougher. I don't think that should be fully necessary for publication, but the way I would go about it is more positing specific plausible alternatives and showing exactly what tests rule them out. So a reader can kind of have a little bit more structure as to why benchmarking is the most likely explanation. Finally, probably what you should do is ignore everything I said and do everything that the referee wants and make the paper better based on their comments. Thank you guys. Thank everybody very much for the opportunity to discuss. And I look forward to chatting about the paper afterwards.
Thank you so much for the discussion. I think you raised a lot of great points that I can't cover in the short amount of time. But yeah, I take on board the point. Maybe the way I need to go is, really say that I'm trying to show the existence of benchmarking, but not that it's necessarily driving all of the emissions reductions. I have, an anecdote in the paper where a facility introduced a boiler, reduced its CO2 emissions by 4%, and that was all completed within 3 days. But that's not necessarily generalizable to all facilities in all industries. So I totally take the point. I appreciate the points about motivation and thinking about the SOX literature. And yeah, maybe we can sort of chat after this and sort of flesh it out in more detail. So thank you again.